Hello and welcome along once again to It'll Be Alright in the 90s, the 90s nostalgia podcast in pole position in Wessex, but soon to be demoted 10 places on the grid for various irregularities. I'm Stu Joslin and joining me as always is Alex Greenwood. Greenie, good evening mate, how are you?
Hi Stu, I'm alright thanks. I'm actually in a terrible cycle of repeat cringe watching the Prince Charles Full Monty post office video that we mentioned in the last episode. And we did link to it actually in the episode description, so go and have a look at it if you haven't already seen it. But I can't stop watching it. It's just magnetic. There's something about it.
Well, I watched it once and only once, and that was enough. So I'm exactly the opposite to you. I was able to stop watching it. It's one of the worst things I've had to watch, I think, in the entire history. I would put that below Bobby Davro in the Stocks.
Wow, okay.
In my list of things that I have disliked watching for this podcast.
Yeah, it's funny because both of them are in my top 5 most watched videos on YouTube.
But it's good to have that balance between us as presenters, I think.
Yes.
This is why we work together so well.
Yeah, absolutely.
We don't need to watch any such embarrassing clips tonight, although there are a few car crash moments because we're talking about the British Touring Car Championships of the 90s this evening. We like to try and line up our sponsors with the episode content. We've got a great sponsor for our episode this time, and it's Auto Bits of Caution. Simply quote, all right 90s at the counter for 10% off all tax disc holders, motion sickness strips and steering wheel covers. So many thanks to Auto Bits of Caution for helping us out with the sponsorship tonight. Alex, have you ever been driven in a car that had a motion sickness strip attached to the rear?
Yes. Well, this has always fascinated me. Like, it's such a weird, distant memory of cars having these things. And seeing them and asking, like my parents, so what is that thing those cars have on the back? And them saying, oh, it stops you getting car sick. It made no sense to me. And it still doesn't really make any sense to me. It's just a little bit of plastic or metal that hangs off the bottom of the car and touches the ground, doesn't it? Yeah, it stops you feeling car sick somehow. But is it to do with a build-up of static electricity or something?
I think it is, yeah. I think that's the point. I mean, I had never figured it out until a couple of years ago when I actually looked it up because it had been bothering me for so long. What were they? But I'm glad that we had the same thoughts and same problems with it. And yeah, I was just as mystified as you were to find out what they were actually for. But they must work. I mean, they have to. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been on the back of all those family saloons in the 90s, would they? So
you say that, but you don't see them around very much, do you, anymore? In fact, you never see them around anymore. Maybe they're sort of integrated now or something.
I'm thinking that's possibly the reason, but I'm going to see if I can find one that's still on sale, and if there is one, I will attach it to the back of my own car and see if my motion sickness improves, because I am always throwing up when I'm driving. It's terrible.
It is terrifying as well. I've been in the car with you.
It's really bad for the passengers, isn't it? So we'll see what we can do. I should say that 10% discount also extends to mud flaps as well. So please do get yourself down to Auto Bits to take advantage of that offer.
Those motion sickness things as well. I mean, we're just glossing over the fact that somehow static electricity makes you feel car sick, which is, I don't know where that comes from. But I'd also read that there's a possibility that they're to stop your car blowing up when you're filling up with fuel, because if there's too much static electricity, when you put the fuel filler and it touches the side of your car, just putting it in, it'll create a spark and blow up. But I mean, were cars just blowing up in the 70s and 80s before they introduced these things or something?
What website did you read this on?
Well, I don't know. Good question. It was some disreputable part of the automotive internet, the automotive dark web.
That's where Quentin Wilson is these days. So.
Yeah.
Time for a quick look at the pod notice board. Alex, what's pinned up on there this time?
Well, Stu, we are nothing if not timely on this podcast. And of course, Red Nose Day was happening 2 weeks ago today. It's actually tomorrow from when we record, but obviously we have a bit of a delay between recording and releasing the episodes. So we're almost on time with this, but it is Red Nose Day around this time. And I just wanted to know if you had any 90s memories from the big day.
I remember that it was compulsory to get hold of a red nose to take into primary school. I remember the original just hard plastic red noses. And then they started to play with the form, didn't they? So every couple of years there'd be a different nose. I remember there was one red nose that had a nose of its own, and when you squeezed it, it would sort of fold out like a party blower, if you get my meaning.
Yes.
That's probably the one that I remember the most.
Can I stop you there, actually, because I've done a bit of research and I've got a quiz. It's not really a quiz; it's a challenge, and you basically started doing it yourself there.
Okay.
which is, can you name the 5 different red noses from comic reliefs over the 90s? Now, the one you've just named there wasn't actually in the 90s. It was just after the 90s, I think. So there's still 5 to get. And you also described the original hard plastic one, which was from 1988. That was the first one. So there's still 5 out there, which you haven't named. Can you name the 5 or describe the 5 red noses from the 90s?
Oh dear.
Listeners join in at home.
Yeah. Blimey, you've really outdone yourself here. This is a quiz that I can't provide any answers for at all. You're going to have to fill me in, I'm afraid.
It was a toughie, but I bet there's people out there who will know all of these. So the first one in 1991 was the Stonker, and that was a hard plastic one that had 2 hands sticking out, or 2 arms / hands sticking out the side of it. Then in 1993 it was the Tomato Nose, so it was basically looked like a tomato, had the green bit on top. Then in 1995 it was the heat sensitive one, so it was a little bit like it was like that was all the rage, wasn't it, in the 90s, sort of heat sensitive things like international hypercolor t-shirts and all that stuff. And there was a t-shirt as well, wasn't there, that was heat sensitive, I remember. And then in 97 there was the Shaggy Nose, which was the furry one,
of course,
which I'm surprised you didn't get. And then in 1999 there was the Big Red Hooter, which if it was sort of glittery and if you squeezed it, it made a hooting noise, basically. It was like a joke squeezy thing. And they were the 5 from the 90s.
I mean, they all sound so familiar now, particularly the furry nose. I remember the Spice Girls being involved with the furry nose to a great extent, actually. That's all coming back to me now. And yes, I definitely had a furry nose and a great big hooter, and I think a tomato as well. My main memory of the actual TV extravaganza is of 1997. I remember everybody being excited because there was a 10-minute Only Fools and Horses presentation, which they'd clearly recorded during the recording for the trilogy in 96, which was supposed to be the last ever episodes. Yeah. So this was going to be the last ever Only Fools and Horses sort of program that was out there until they sort of ill-advisedly came back in the early 2000s for a few more. And I remember, Comic Relief 97 with great fondness. Yeah,
I think the 90s were very much the heyday of Comic Relief and Red Nose Days. So although it's declined a little bit, I think, in terms of ratings on the TV, it's obviously still a fantastic cause, and you should definitely go and donate, which I'm sure you can still do, even though it is a couple of weeks ago. So go and do that.
Of course, a very, very worthy cause. It's probably a victim of appointment TV not really being a thing anymore like it was in the 90s. But yes, definitely, if you've got a few quid, then throw it in Comic Relief's direction, because it's always well appreciated by those that need it most.
We need more big novelty checks on this podcast, don't we?
I think we do. Yeah, that's a good point.
If anyone wants to donate any money to us, however big or small, even if it's just a few quid, anything that gives us an opportunity to use a big novelty check and get a photo op with it, we really welcome. So send in your donations and send it direct to us rather than to Jeff, because we know what will happen with it there.
Yeah, something will happen. It will probably go through Dad of the Pod, won't it? And then something will happen with it that we don't know about. Do you remember very early on in podcast history, we were talking about buying a pitch side advertising hoarding, a non-league football club,
yes,
with the podcast logo on it? Yeah. If we ever get around to doing that, we should, of course, pitch up at the club in question with a big novelty check, and present it that way. What do you think?
That would be fantastic. Yeah, I can just see the content right now, like spot on. Let's do it.
If you're listening out there and you are attached to a non-league football club that's looking for sponsorship, please do let us know and we will get the novelty check ready. I'll fold it up and put it in my wallet. A little bit of 90s chocolate bar chat. This coming in from regular correspondent Alex Mitchell. He says, good shout with the fuse. It's probably the most 90s, to be honest. So he's siding with me there. Thoughts the most 90s chocolate bar. He says the Yorkies sprung to mind for their slogan, "It's not for girls," which feels very 90s. But after a quick search, that slogan wasn't introduced until 2001, so clearly not. He then goes on to suggest that we should talk about things that you thought were from the 90s but aren't. And then goes on to suggest that the Belly's Gonna Get Your Reebok adverts fall into that category. So thanks for that, Alex. If anybody's got anything that they always think was from the 90s but actually isn't, maybe like that red nose I was talking about earlier, then please do let us know.
We can add that to the list along with your 90s packaging and your 90s shop receipts, both of which we want you to continue sending in.
Those categories are still very much open.
So some more correspondence here on the chocolate bars of the 90s. Well, actually, I'll tell you what the poll result was, because we did a poll on Instagram for what you thought was the most 90s out of our 3 options. And Fuse was the winner with 63% of the vote. Then Spyro with 25%, and the Wildlife Bar got 12%. So I think you got it there, Stu, with the Fuse. That seemed to be the one that resonated the most with people.
That one's for you, Mrs. Jarvis.
We did also get some other suggestions coming in on Instagram and Twitter. So Mark from Glasgow, friend of the pod, said he loved the Secret Bar or the Shoe People Bar. We also did post a picture of the Shoe People Bar on our Instagram if anyone saw that, which is obviously a tie-in with something. Was Shoe People a TV program, or was it just a toy or something?
I have no idea whatsoever.
Oh, actually, sorry, Mark from Glasgow goes on. It was, he says it was basically like a small Whisper. I think it's about the size of a Freddo bar. But yeah, definitely not something I remember. Colon Up Music says he really misses the Topic, which I think is quite recently departed. But he says for Ultra 90s, I'll say the Snowflake, which I looked up and it was like a white chocolate version of the flake, wasn't it, I think. The Art Cart Bristol says the Whisper Gold. I'm surprised they stopped making that because that was so popular.
Well, you can put your surprise to one side because they definitely haven't. I had a Whisper Gold very recently indeed.
Are you sure it wasn't a really old vending machine? Check the date on it. You weren't down Springfield, were you? They weren't selling.
I've got the wrapper here. Wait a second. Oh yeah, February 1993. Jeez. Okay.
Did you buy it with a Panda lemonade as well? Okay. Well, in that case, Art Cart Bristol. I mean, to be fair, she doesn't say it's out of print as it were, but they just say it's the most 90s. Legend of the Pod Kate Pro brings up the Topic again, but also says the Walnut Whip. Didn't that come back as well? I think the Walnut Whip might still be around. Maybe I'm wrong there. I don't know. Ecto Violent says the Armageddon film tie-in Nestle Nuclear Bar. I don't know if you remember that, but very niche. Can't have been around for very long if it was tied into a specific film. And then there's some more love here for the Spyro. And then finally, Leopard Print Addict 80 says Nuts About Caramel, which was a form of the Cadbury's Caramel Bar, I assume. Finally, Oddpod, friend of the pod, Oddpod, on Twitter said the first ones that came to mind were Freddo, Taz, Club, and Trio. Are we including Club and Trio as chocolate bars? Or is that a chocolate biscuit?
Yeah, that's a good point. I would say it's more of a chocolate biscuit. I mean, if you like a lot of chocolate on your biscuit, join our club, right?
Yeah.
The clue's in the jingle.
Yeah. Okay, we'll have to strike that from the record, and Trio as well. I think it's along the same sort of lines. But Freddo and Taz, you can definitely have. So thank you for all of your answers on that question. It seemed to be one of our most popular questions, I think. We got a lot of feedback on that. So thank you for everyone for sending in your chocolate.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's always great to hear from everybody on these subjects, and we hope to generate as much interest with our next What's the Most 90s, which is coming up very shortly. I've got some more car news here for you, Alex.
Go on.
This is a story that caught my eye in the week before we recorded this episode. Ferrari stolen from F1 driver Gerhard Berger recovered 28 years later. The Met Police seized the vehicle stolen in Italy in 1995 and worth £350,000 in London as it was about to be sold to a US buyer. So this is a 90s F1 driver, Gerhard Berger, who had his Ferrari F5112M Testarossa stolen at the Imola track in San Marino in 1995 as he was preparing to race in the Grand Prix. The car has been missing all that time for nearly 30 years. And then just in the last couple of weeks, Ferrari alerted police that the car was in the UK and about to be sold to a US buyer. I'm not sure if Gerhard's going to get the car back, but it's good to see that even after nearly 30 years, these 90s crimes are still being looked at and being resolved as and where possible. And I just hope that Gerhard does get reunited with his Ferrari. Only about 500 were ever made, so a rare beast indeed.
Yeah, it's quite a striking looking car. I've seen it since this news story came out, and I'm glad it's been recovered, and hopefully the detectives will now turn their attention to 40RA and find where that is in the world. Yeah,
why don't you solve some real crimes? I've got a bit of music news here as well. A couple of points I'd like to bring up. First of all, one of our most 90s bands that we've spoken about at length on the podcast before, and they certainly came up in our underrated albums chat a couple of weeks ago. They're coming to the UK in November to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the release of their defining album. It's the Crash Test Dummies. They're coming over to the UK.
They are, yeah. Is this something else we've resurrected along with Badgeline Buses and...
Personally, I don't think our influence can be understated here. I really don't. Yeah, I think we're probably one of the driving forces for this. Suffice it to say that I will be getting in touch with the Trinity Art Centre at Bristol to ask for some press passes to be given to us for It'll Be Alright in the 90s team, so that we can go along and review the gig, of course. So I'll let you know how I get on with that.
That'd be great. Yeah, imagine they might even get us backstage to do an interview or something.
That'd be fantastic. Can you imagine?
Yeah, that would be fantastic. Please, Trinity Arts Centre and management of Crash Test Dummies, we are here. We're willing to put the time and hours into it, and you know that it'll be a good interview. So do what you can.
Anything we can do to help grease the wheels of the CTD return to the UK, we are willing to do, absolutely, but only if we get free tickets. The other musical point I'd just like to bring up is that it's a very happy 25th birthday last weekend as we record this to one of my favourite albums of the 90s, Performance and Cocktails by Stereophonics, mentioned in the Most 90s album cover again earlier on this series. Reached its quarter century back at the start of March, and I'd just like to wish it a very happy birthday, and may it continue to give me the same comfort and entertainment it has for another 25 years.
Lovely stuff. I think I might put it on actually after this record, because it's been so long since I've listened to it, but it was a big album in my youth as well, so long overdue a re-listen.
It was. I gave it a full play over the weekend, and it delighted me as it always has. So yeah, happy birthday, Performance and Cocktails.
Time now for What's the Most 90s, and as Stu alluded to earlier, we are talking about what the Most 90s website is. So Stu, what were you thinking about this?
Back when Shay Joslin first got dial-up internet in 1998, 1999, having your own presence on the internet was a very much more difficult thing to do than it is now. You had to actually physically build a website in order to have a website. And I got into this very early indeed. I was very, very interested in web design, and I used to love designing websites about anything and everything. One of the first platforms I used to design my own websites was a thing called FreeServe My Sites. So you might guess that we were with FreeServe as our internet service provider. But just as an aside here, we actually signed up with a company called Supernet, SUPANET, I remember. They got taken over by FreeServe. FreeServe then briefly became Wanadoo before that got subsumed into Orange, which then got taken over by EE. And my parents to this day are still with EE for their broadband. So there's brand loyalty for you across 5 different brands. Anyway, that's besides the point. FreeServe My Sites provided a very basic but very usable online website builder. So you didn't need any software or anything like that. You could just go in, you could fill in the text fields, do all the design on the website, on the browser, and then publish it and have a web address. And I did this many, many times. My first ever websites were built on FreeServe My Sites, and I'd love to go back and see some of them now. Unfortunately, I don't think the Internet Wayback Machine, which I usually use for such exercises, has recorded any FreeServe My Sites. I subsequently moved on to using platforms like GeoCities and things like that. But FreeServe My Sites is definitely, I think, the website I used most in the 90s, and therefore by proxy, my most 90s website. This was also a time, of course, when having anything about yourself out on the internet, especially as an 10, 11, 12-year-old, was a very, very dangerous thing to do indeed. And I was always worried that something would happen as a result of me having a little website that said, hello, my name is Stu and I like cars and the Stereophonics. But I'm still here, and nothing ever has come of it. So there you go. FreeServe My Sites for me.
Very nice. I don't remember it. We weren't FreeServe. We weren't a FreeServe family. So I don't remember it. And I certainly wasn't making my own websites at this age. My first thoughts were very similar to those. So, and also you touched upon them just then, because any website that was made using GeoCities or Angel Fire, I think were so nice. It had such a clear 90s aesthetic and just general feel, and they were really around, that early stages of the internet. But I've gone for a more specific site than that, and it's actually one that looks like it was probably made on GeoCities, but I don't think it was, because it was such a big website at the time, and that is the Space Jam website from 1996.
Oh, well done. Congratulations, you've won. Well done.
And this is primarily, Stu, I'm sure you are aware of this, because it's still there in its original form. You can find it. There was an updated version for the new Space Jam sequel from a few years ago, but the original is also still there. And it's just it's a real time capsule from 90s internet design. It's got all those sort of classics from the era. So it's got the big basic patterned wallpaper. I think it looks like a night sky. It's got a very basic serif font at the bottom, the cartoon icons, very low functionality. And it's just exactly what 90% of websites were like in this era. So I just wanted to choose it because it was, like I said, you can still go and see it now. It's a time capsule. Also, it's obviously tied into a very 90s film from 1996. And I just had to choose it for those reasons.
That's fantastic. The fact that it's in its original place on the internet still to this day is such a great thing, as you say, for a reference back to how web design was in the early days of the internet, and also just to have a website untouched left there as a relic for future generations to enjoy. And obviously it still enjoys a certain degree of sort of notoriety to this day, doesn't it, for still being there? Yeah. So I think you might have it there. I think I might have to bow out gracefully with Free Serve My Sites into second place. I think Space Jam takes it.
Thank you very much. But it's actually not just us two who are deciding this one today, because our friend Amy from across the Atlantic in America, the presenter of the Pop Culture Retrospective podcast, has got involved, and she's asked her listeners for their thoughts, and she's going to give her own thoughts as well. So, Amy, what do you think?
Hello, Alex, Stu, and all of the It'll Be All Right in the 90s podcast listeners. This is Amy Lewis, the host of the Pop Culture Retrospective podcast, and I wanted to give you a report out on what I found my listeners remember when they think of websites that just scream 1990s. Here is a list of the responses that I got both from my podcast episode, and I also asked listeners on Instagram and Twitter. The Drudge Report, MapQuest, the original Yahoo, Ain't It Cool News, Ask Jeeves, GeoCities, AOL, MySpace, ICQ, AOL chat rooms, and my personal favorite website that just epitomizes the 1990s, at least in the United States, Hamsterdance, of hamsterdance.com. So there's my list of websites that just scream 1990s.
Right then, Stu, some good names there. Definitely some things that came back to me. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, another shout for GeoCities. Ask Jeeves, of course. Possibly the most 90s search engine if we're going to do a two for here. I think maybe with Lycos in second place. Some absolutely great shouts there.
Yeah, absolutely. AOL I really associate with the free discs that you would get on the front of PC magazines for like free internet. I never really understood how they worked. It's not something we ever used, but it was like all over the place back in the late 90s, wasn't it? Free internet CDs.
Yeah, I think clearly it was like a sort of proto, like you get now with a subscription service, which is like put this CD in your computer and you'll get free internet for a month, and then we'll charge you the earth for it afterwards. So props to them, but there must be hundreds of thousands of those CDs just in landfill or wherever now, choking the planet slowly. So thanks for that, AOL.
America underground now.
Underwater.
Thank you very much, Amy, for that. And we urge our listeners to go and listen to Amy's podcast, Pop Culture Retrospective, and you can find a link to it in the episode description below. So yeah, do go and check it out.
Time now for the main topic of our episode tonight. We're going back to the motorsport arena. This one has been hanging around for a while. I'm delighted we're finally getting to do it. We're talking touring cars in the 90s. Alex, what's your personal memory and connection with touring cars in the 90s, first of all?
Well, as you know, Stu, from the mid to late 90s, I lived and breathed Formula One. It was very much my whole life, really, at this point. But as a sort of byproduct of that, I was also into other forms of motorsport because I was just sort of looking for anything I could get hold of, like the one qualifying session and race every other weekend, as it was back then. Wasn't quite enough to sate my appetite for motorsport. So I was looking for other avenues, and touring cars was one of them. I was sort of watching anything I could get hold of, really. So Superbikes as well. And I think there was a program on Channel 4 weekend mornings called Motorsport Mondial or International
Yes,
Motorsport, something like that. Yeah, there was.
Yep.
You could get little bits, couldn't you, here and there, but the touring cars would be on other weekends quite regularly, so I would watch that. And I think around 97, 98, 99, maybe 2000 was when I was most into it. And I knew a lot of the drivers, but I think really most of my knowledge comes from, of course, the Toka racing games on the PlayStation 1. And I think on the PC, Toka 1 and Toka 2, which came out in, I think, 98 and 99, which I just played religiously. They were such good racing games, up there with Gran Turismo and Colin McRae Rally, I think. And I got just a load of knowledge from them, basically, getting to race those cars around the tracks and getting to know them firsthand, as it were. So that's sort of where my knowledge starts and ends, really, around 97 to, the end of the decade. What about you?
Well, you've picked a good 3 years to concentrate on if that's your area of expertise. That's absolutely fantastic. I loved the Toka racing games as well, 1 and 2, commentary by Tiff Needell, of course, a very familiar voice providing the race commentary. I used to love the cheat code which would allow you to unlock a Hades track. Did you ever do that on I can't remember which Toka game it was, but there was like a hell track, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Yeah, with like lava and stuff on the track, which was really, really good. So yeah, that is one of the acknowledged as one of the greatest racing games for the PS1, as you say, rightly beside Gran Turismo and the others that you mentioned.
I think it's worth mentioning that maybe the greatest cheat of all racing games of all time was being able to unlock the tank as well. Was that on the first one or the second one?
Of course, how could I forget that?
And you could fire missiles and it would make the cars go flying up in the air. It was such a good cheat.
I'm going to have to watch that on YouTube after we finish that. I'd forgotten all about that. Oh, thank you for reminding me. I appreciate that. Hello everybody, it's Stu here, and also Algie the cat, coming to you in high fidelity audio for once, seeing as I'm not talking to Alex on Skype. I'm here at our secret It'll Be Alright in the 90s HQ edit suite location, just putting together our touring cars episode, and what I wanted to do at this point was drop in some audio that really added something around the Hades tank cheat on Toka touring cars that we were talking about. I couldn't really find anything that would do that. However, what I did find was an extra Easter egg cheat thing from the game that I wasn't aware of, and it made me laugh a lot, so I'm putting it in here for you now as a little bonus. So please enjoy Tiff Needell losing his mind and doing some Olympic standard swearing while getting his lines wrong, recording the commentary for the Toka touring cars game.
Bringing up the rear, the new Audi driver is really going to have his Bringing up the rear, the new Audi driver is really going to have this work cut out. I'm going to get this page. I'm going to kill him. Bringing up the rear, the new Renault driver is really going to have his work cut out to get... Does the script writer ever read these out loud, or does he just write them? Have his work cut out to get him, bastard. I bet he never reads them out loud once. Right, I will continue.
So my connection with touring cars, I think, is that it was, in contrast to Formula One, accessible. So I think I liked it because, first of all, the cars that were being raced were cars like the cars that my dad drove and my friend's parents drove. So let me, for instance, give you a rundown of what was being raced in the 1998 Touring Car Championship, which is one of my favourite seasons. And this is the manufacturer entries. So you had the Renault Laguna, the Volvo S40, the Honda Accord, the Audi A4, the Nissan Primera, the Peugeot 406, the Ford Mondeo, the Alfa Romeo 156, which didn't actually enter into that season, even though it was on the entry list, and of course the Vauxhall Vectra. Now those are all cars, would you say they're sort of repmobiles from that era?
Absolutely, yeah.
But then on a Saturday afternoon on Grandstand, you could find them being raced around at these tracks around the country. And I think that's why I got into it, because I loved cars at the time. I could tell you what every sort of make and model on the road was, and I just enjoyed seeing them raced in this fashion. I always rooted for Vauxhall because my dad obviously had the 4x4 Cavalier at the time. We actually also visited Thruxton in 1996 or 1997. I have no idea why my dad decided that he wanted to take my mother and myself down to Thruxton to see the touring cars, but we did. I remember it clearly. I meant to ask him actually what his memories are of this and why he decided to do it that day. I'll have to ask him and come back to you next time for that. But I remember we were at one of the corners and a kind family who we were stood near let me stand on top of their cool box so that I could get a better view over the tyre barrier, which was really nice. As I've just alluded to there, plenty of manufacturers involved, plenty of manufacturer teams and manufacturer support from the actual car makers, which if you look at the entry list for the most recent touring car championship is not there anymore. There's maybe 2 or 3 manufacturer-backed teams, and the rest are now independent entries. I think that's a real shame. I think the death of the Touring Car Works team is really something to be mourned.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was the super touring era, wasn't it, of touring cars, which lasted pretty much exactly through the 90s and then ended, I think, around 2002-ish or something like that. And so the cars were just so cool. It is the golden era of touring cars. That's not just me looking through nostalgia tinted glasses. I think it's widely regarded as the best era. So I don't know if you know what the regulations were for super touring, Stu, but it meant that the car had to be at least 4.2 meters in length. Well, I like that as a rule, that it has to be bigger than a certain, like the limit is the size, and it's got to be bigger than that rather than smaller. And it had to have 4 doors, which I think is another great rule. There's no just putting in a little tiny Peugeot 205 or something and putting a massive engine in. It has to be a big car. And obviously the cars have to be based on production cars, as you said. So you are seeing your dad's company car racing around Snetterton on a Saturday afternoon. To get around those regulations, which sound quite restrictive, they would do sort of quite crazy stuff and quite expensive stuff, apparently. This is partly why they got rid of the super touring era, because it was so expensive. But they would put the engines really low and far back, so they were sort of almost mid-engined, but in the front. And I think the drivers would sit really low, and everything just looked cool, basically. I mean, we're going to get onto the cars in a minute, but yeah, definitely the golden era for touring cars.
Absolutely. I mean, if we take a look at the 1994 championship, for instance, where Alfa Romeo with Gabriele Tarquini, the former F1 driver, were absolutely dominating. Quite a number of their fellow competitor manufacturers actually complained that the Alfa Romeo was too dominant, and they were made to scale back some of the aerodynamic features on the car in order to level the playing field out slightly. But by then, this was about 5 rounds into the championship. They pulled out so far ahead that they couldn't actually be caught in the end. And Tarquini did win the championship that year. But they actually missed a race in protest as well at that decision. In that sense, it's a racing series where teams are trying to find that competitive edge. They have been given these rules to deal with. There's a car that I want to mention a bit later on. Maybe you can guess which one it is already, that fits very much into this bigger is better rules that the Super Tours had at the time. And it just made for a great and really exciting series. As I say, you could see the highlights on Grandstand on a Saturday afternoon with Murray Walker in the commentary box, which also added so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, he was doing this at the same time as doing the Formula One. It's sort of amazing, really, that he was able to do both. Without doubt, the greatest sports commentator of all time. Would hope we could both agree on that. Yeah, again, some of the moments we're going to talk about in a bit, I think, are partly famous because of his commentary more than the racing itself. But yeah, like a massive part of touring cars in the 90s was Murray's voice.
I think maybe that was a contributory factor to it being so popular in the 90s, that it had that primetime slot on BBC One on a Saturday afternoon. Now you have to look for it on ITV4. They do a whole day's worth of coverage with all the support races, so you have to sift through and find out what times the races are. But here you had the highlights, you had Murray commentating, you had all these manufacturing teams entering the races, and there were always thrills and spills. Every single moment I've got written down here is a famous crash from BTCC in the 90s. It's just a great time for the series. Well, seeing as we've touched upon it already, I think we better talk about some of our favourite cars from the series in the 90s. And I think by the sound of things, we might have hit upon the same thing. So, Alex, do you want to pull the Quentin Wilson Motor Show style cover off what we've picked?
Well, I've actually had to stitch together 2 separate tarpaulins to get over this car because it is rather a large one. It's obvious what I'm talking about here and what you're going to be talking about, I'm sure. It's the coolest touring car ever. Maybe one of the coolest racing cars of all time. It's the 1994 Volvo 850
Of course it is. Of course it is.
Because if you take a Volvo Estate racing you are officially the coolest team in the history of motorsport. In the classic blue and white Securicore livery, driven by Rickard Rydell and Jan Lammers. Yeah, it was massive. It's a massive car. And it's bizarre. Just the footage of it racing around doesn't look right, but it does look so right at the same time. Have you read into why they chose the estate? You must have done.
I have, yeah, but you'll have to enlighten our listeners.
Volvo, going into this, had quite a long history, I think, in touring cars from the 80s, maybe even the 70s, where they were quite successful. And then the brand had become less known for sportiness and much more for like family runarounds and sort of more practicality based motoring. And so they were trying to think of some way of boosting their appeal and their sort of sex appeal, I suppose. So they thought, you know what, let's get back into touring cars. Let's do something a bit different. There was an element of it that was, let's choose the estate because it's got better aerodynamics, apparently. But I think the main reason was, by their own admission, was this is going to get us so much attention because it's so weird to enter this racing series with an estate. So they really went for it. And there was one race where on the warm-up lap, they actually drove round with a large stuffed Alsatian on the parcel shelf on the back, just to really drive the point home that this was your average family estate car. So they're really, like diving in with both feet and enjoying it. And it did pretty well, didn't it? I think it came eighth maybe in the manufacturers championship. And got some good results in there. So it was a good car. And I think it was run by Tom Walkinshaw Racing. So it had good pedigree behind the team. It just looks amazing. And obviously spawned a couple of road-going sporty versions, the 850 T5, I think, and the 850R, one of which I mentioned in my Dream Garage a few episodes back. So, yeah, I love it completely.
It's so good, isn't it? I mean, it's so different as well, so unique to see it going around. I'm just disappointed that they only ran it for one season. They went back to saloons after this season. So clearly it was an idea just for one season to get some attention and get people talking about Volvo and maybe investing in one. I mean, what an absolutely brilliant idea.
I did read somewhere a while back that one of the reasons they'd also done it was because they thought it would demoralize the opposition to be overtaken by an estate car. So there's like a psychological element to it as well. So any other cars then, Stu, that can compete with that? You've already said that you supported the Vauxhalls, generally speaking, throughout the 90s. So I'm guessing the Vectra stood out to you.
The Vectra, the Cavalier before that. Yeah, absolutely. I was a follower of the Vauxhall team, as I've said, and they had some great cars and some great liveries. John Cleland, who we'll discuss later in one of our moments of the 90s for the BTCC, was Mr. Vauxhall during this period. He drove for the Works team throughout the decade. Also have a big soft spot for the Fords of the early 90s. So back in sort of 1990 and 1991, the car of choice, again, when it was more independently dominated, the championship, was the Sierra Cosworth and then the Sierra Sapphire after that. And a lot of teams ran these cars, and they just look superb as well. And it was a shame when they got phased out for the Mondeo coming in later on. Again, more of which later. So yeah, the Ford Sierra and the various Vauxhalls. I think they even ran an Astra in the early 90s as well. So they moved up from the hatchback to the saloon. But yeah, no, I think the Vauxhalls, probably one white, one red in the late 90s as well, was probably my favourite cars of the decade. But they're not nearly as interesting to talk about as a Volvo 850, I'm afraid.
No. What about the liveries then, Stu? We've talked about the cars sort of generally, but what about the liveries?
Well, you know as well as I do how much we enjoy a livery on this podcast. Again, if I go back to the early 90s, there was a Sierra Cosworth, which I think Tim Harvey drove, which had a beautiful royal blue Labatt's livery with "Don't drink and drive" written across the side of the written across the side of the car. You remember that one? My other favourite one is a car that wasn't really successful in any other way. It's the 1998 Peugeot 406, which you might remember from Toka 2, which it featured in. The green and gold Esso Ultron livery for the Peugeot, which then the Renault went to as well, from sort of yellow and blue. The classic Williams Racing Renault factory team then went to a Nescafe sponsored green and gold car after that. But I think Peugeot were in there first. And that's one that sticks in my mind, just so I think those colours went together really well. What liveries stick out for you?
For me, there is one livery that is iconic from touring cars from the 90s, and that is the Renault Lagunas that you just mentioned of, I think, 96, 97, maybe 95 as well, but certainly 96 and 97, when it was the classic Renault yellow and blue livery. Alain Menu, of course, won the title in 97 driving this car, and it featured on the front cover of Toka 1, the first touring car game. And it's just, I think that the Laguna itself is a really good looking car. We didn't mention it in the cars section, but it is a really just handsome car in all guises. But in this livery, it looks especially good. They did actually do a road version, like a sporty road version of the Laguna called the RT Sport, which came in the yellow of the livery all over. And that's a beautiful car. That's probably in my dream garage as well. There is currently one for sale on Car and Classic for £6,500, which I'm thinking about, maybe delving into the pod savings and buying
that
the
Apple
company
podcast
car.
money. I mean, have we seen that from Jeff yet?
No, that's true. When that comes in, I'm going to see if he'll allow me to splash them out on that. But I do like liveries. When a team has a livery that goes across disciplines. So that Renault blue and yellow livery was also used in their rally car. So it was used in their Megane, which appeared in the Colin McRae Rally computer game, just to tie it back to another computer game. So I like the fact that it was used across different disciplines, which was also true of Vauxhall as well, because before they had the red and white, they had that sort of Vauxhall white with a yellow sort of splash on the side. And I know they used that in German touring cars as well on the Calibra. I think they also used it on maybe some other different motorsport events, but it was like the Vauxhall livery. And then a couple of other little ones that I also realised was the Toyota Carinas in a Castrol livery, I think in 93 or 4. Who doesn't love a Castrol livery on a motorsport team? Obviously, that's another thing that went across the teams, because Toyota used a Castrol livery on their Supras in the Japanese Touring Car Championship, the most iconic Gran Turismo car, the Castrol Supra. And also, you touched upon the Ford Sapphires earlier. There was one of them that had a great shell livery, just red and yellow, which was fantastic. I could talk about liveries of touring cars for probably another half an hour, but in the interests of our listeners, I will stop there.
Well, I have to say, I haven't thought about the Vauxhall Calibra for about 10 years, and now all I want to do is go and look at pictures of the Vauxhall Calibra. What a car. My Uncle Chris had one. Superb. Oh.
Very cool, yeah. Very much a rival to the Ford Probe, wasn't it? I think.
Very much. Yeah, definitely. One more thing on the Laguna. The title sponsor, Elf, am I right in saying that?
Yes, I think you're right, yeah.
And to have the Williams racing team backing this touring car team and running it as well was a pretty unique thing. I don't think any other Formula One teams did that. And that made them unique and stand out. And obviously they had that really successful season in 97 with Alain Menu and the emergence of Jason Plato as his number 2 driver as well. And he, of course, went on to have sort of 20 years plus in touring cars, didn't he? So there you go. Let's talk about some of the most famous moments from the BTCC in the 90s then. And the first one I'd like to talk about is the famous "The Man's an Animal" incident from the concluding race of the 1992 championship between Steve Soper and John Cleland. Again, 2 great liveries. Steve Soper running in the turquoise Listerine-sponsored BMW. John Cleland in the Works Vauxhall. Cleland is in the running for the championship. Steve Soper's teammate Tim Harvey is also in the running for the championship. Soper lets Harvey through, waves him through on one of the final laps of the race. Going around the next corner, there's a coming together between Soper and Cleland, and they both get wiped out, leaving Harvey a straight run in to take the championship. And there's still, to this day, some rankle and rancor about what happened and who was at fault there.
Soper goes through to 4th position inside the Vauxhall, and Harvey's right behind. Harvey's attacking Cleland. There's Harvey, there's Cleland. So Cleland has stayed ahead, but Soper is ahead of the Vauxhall. So John Cleland is sandwiched between the 2 BMWs. I'm going for first, says John Cleland. But he's got to pass a lot of people, including the battered BMW of Steve Soper. They go round Abbey, and Harvey's coming up. Tim Harvey in the second BMW is inside Cleland at bridge. He's gone through. He's up to 5th position. He's up to 4th position because Steve Soper's let him through. Tim Harvey is leading the championship again. Fantastic. But John Cleland is attacking Soper. He's up on 2 wheels. Soper holds his line. He's pushed right out to the right. He attacks again as they go to the right. Adrian Luffield. And they both spin. They're both out. Soper and Cleland both out of the race. 2 very determined chargers, each refusing to yield, and they've both paid the penalty.
I just have to say, the man chopped me a couple of times, then he runs into me and takes me straight in the barriers. I mean, what are we doing here? Is this stock car racing or is this motorsport? He might get away with that in Germany where he might be Mr. Superstar. But this is clean. The man's an animal.
But there's some great Murray Walker commentary here. I'm sure you watched the clip before the show, Alex. Cleland waving his middle finger at at Steve Soper, and then Murray chipping in with, "I'm going for first," says John Cleland.
It's one of the best bits of improvised commentary in the world of sport, for sure.
It really is. It really is. And then when both cars have spun off into the gravel trap, John Cleland gets out of the car, and he is the most angry-looking stationary man you have ever seen in your life. If you haven't seen this clip, I heartily recommend you watch it. He stands stock still for a couple of seconds, and you wouldn't have not believed it if he'd exploded on the spot. The anger in the man is palpable. It's brilliant. And then, of course, there's a famous on-camera comment straight after the race, "The man's an animal," which has gone down in folklore and made John Cleland famous. So that's my first famous moment of the BTCC from the 90s I wanted to talk about. But there's some background here which you might not be aware of. So Tim Harvey and Steve Soper that season were being run by a team called Vic Lee Motorsport. Nothing so curious in that. However, the racing company was liquidated when Lee and others were convicted of importing drugs hidden in their race transporters worth up to £6 million. And this is the best bit, which shouldn't be funny, but it is. Suspicions were raised due to the number of times the team found it necessary to test at the Zandvoort circuit in the Netherlands.
Oh, that's great.
So the team boss, Vic Lee, was in prison for 12 years then in 1993 due to importing drugs onto the continent in his race transporters along with the BMWs. He didn't learn his lesson. In 2005, Lee was charged again with 2 others and convicted of drug trafficking offences when £1.7 million worth of Class A drugs was discovered in the boot of his car, and he received another 12 years imprisonment. So there you go. That's a bit of background about Vic Lee.
I mean, if you get caught for that once and you still want to do crime, you've got to do a different crime, surely. Mm-hmm. And don't just have it in your boot either. Yes, I do urge everyone to go and watch that clip of Cleland versus Soper on YouTube. We'll put a link below, but it really is. Even if you're not into touring cars, well, thank you for listening this far. But we also really recommend you go and watch that clip because it's well worth it. And the one moment that stands out for me in the 90s was Matt Neal becoming the first privateer to win the overall race victory in a touring car race, which he did at Donington in 1999 in his Team Dynamics Primera, Nissan Primera. The organizer of the BTCC at the time, I think it was him anyway, had offered £250,000 to the first privateer who could complete this task, because it was so seen as so impossible. Because actually the rules, it wasn't just about the money that the teams had. There were rules like the privateers couldn't run the same tyres as the factory teams, and there was some other limitations as well. So it wasn't even like they were starting from the same level playing field in terms of the mechanics. So it was unfair, and Matt Neal always pointed that out at the time and subsequently. But amazingly, he won this race, and I remember watching it live, one of the rare races that I did watch live.
It's something I dreamt about and never thought was achievable. Everyone looks back at the Super Touring with rose-tinted glasses, with fondness, but it was incredibly unfair. As an independent, you weren't allowed the same tyres, you weren't allowed the same engines, you weren't allowed the same everything, and that was the first ever race that the independents had the same tyres as the factory cars, and we won that weekend, first time out.
And it was just a fantastic achievement, yeah. And then he obviously went on to win the championship 3 times in the 2000s and became, a massive driver in BTCC. And this is sort of where he staked his flag in the world of touring cars. And it was a hell of an achievement. Do you remember this?
I do, yeah. Matt Neal had driven privateer cars for many, many years. I think going back as sort of early as 1991 or 2, I think. So he's another one who's had a massive history in the sport, and also, of course, most famous for his somewhat pantomime rivalry with Jason Plato, we have to say, although I'm not sure I would say that to either of their faces. But yeah, no, that was definitely a big moment, and the gap between the privateer teams and the factory teams started to close a bit more often after that. So it was great for the sport.
Do you have any other moments that you want to talk about?
A couple of other things. Just a mention for one of my favourite drivers of the 90s, a chap from New Zealand called Paul Radisich, who drove for Ford and then latterly Peugeot. I'm not sure why I latched onto him. It might be the fact that there was an Antipodean stroke Eastern European heritage thing, the same as Mark Bosnich. So yeah, there's obviously some sort of similarity there between the two, and that was why I jumped onto Paul Radisich. I'm afraid I couldn't find it, but there's another classic Murray commentary moment which I remember very well. Radisich wasn't having a great season. The car had given up on him again, or he'd been spun out again where it wasn't his fault. Murray comes out with the line, Paul Radisich, he's a guy who really does have all the luck, and it's all bad, which I've always remembered. So that's another great one. Again, I think you might be right in your assertion that Murray might be the greatest British sports commentator of all time. I did blanch a little bit when I thought of Barry Davies when you initially suggested this, but I think when you're able to think of things like that on your feet at these pivotal moments, then you have to take your hat off to the chap, don't you? Another classic Murray moment again. Will Hoy and Julian Bailey, teammates for the Toyota team, Secura Core Amiga, turquoise and red livery. They're racing against each other, cornering, and Julian Bailey smashes into Will Hoy, flips him upside down. Will Hoy's car slides on its roof along the tarmac and ends up where the camera is as you watch the clip. And you can just see the wheels spinning around on what is now the top of the car. And again, Murray Walker.
Grand Prix driver Julian Bailey is flying. He's attacking his teammate Will Hoy. In fact, he's really attacked him. That's it. Off goes Will Hoy, skating to a standstill on his roof. It's a good thing Will's strapped in. The car upside down is a Toyota with Will Hoy crawling out of it. A pretty bemused Will Hoy, I should think. He's lucky to have got away with that. And he walks away perfectly okay from the look of it.
The car upside down is a Toyota. I mean, what else could you possibly ask for?
Oh, it's so good, isn't it? It's so good.
And that probably brings me on to one of the most, if not the most famous touring car moments of the 90s, which doesn't really even involve a touring car driver. This involves a driver who was a lot more famous for his success in other series in the 90s. He had been the Formula One world champion. He was currently at this time the Indy world champion. This is Nigel Mansell driving in a guest appearance at the Toka Shootout on Halloween 1993 at Donington, driving a Ford Mondeo. And it is simply an awful, awful crash. It's our old friend Tiff Needell again. But it's not really Tiff's fault. I think Tiff has been unfairly maligned for this over the years. If you watch the replay, it's actually John Clennon in the commentary box as well, who talks you through it from a racing driver's perspective.
Mansell is right on the limit. He locks his rear wheel. The car sideways, opposite lock. It's on the curbs, fighting for control. Soper goes through. He's clipped Needell. He's off. And a huge impact. Nigel Mansell very still inside the car. Steam, smoke. Look at that damage. And fire through a brake disc. The marshals quickly on the scene. The race is being stopped. John, what happened?
Well, as you can see, Nigel just locked a brake on the way into the old hairpin and touched the inside curb there and got very, very much oversteer. Tried to correct it, maybe a little bit too much there with the lack of power steering. Steve managed to get through and Tiff braked hard to try to avoid him, but unfortunately, Nigel's hit very hard. That is an enormous accident. That is one of the biggest saloon car accidents I've ever seen.
Nigel was motionless in the car. Thankfully, of course, he was okay. But there is also some in-car footage of the accident as you get to the end of the clip. And it's a really sort of sickening impact. And yeah, we're just obviously glad that Nigel was okay. And he actually came back and raced again for Ford towards the end of the 90s. Interestingly, in a race, I think again at Donington in about 1998, it's regarded as one of the greatest touring car races of all time because it was raced in the wet. Nigel Mansell qualified near the back. But because he was such a master of wet driving conditions, got his way up the field, led the race for a while, and eventually fell back to sort of 4th or 5th in the end. But it's still regarded to this day as one of the touring car's greatest ever driving performances. So a nod to Nigel Mansell, only ever driving as a guest, but somehow synonymous with touring car racing.
Yeah. That crash, did you say it was 93 or 94?
That was 93, Halloween 93, that was.
Yeah, which is a weird day to be racing on because it's so late in the year, but I guess it was just a one-off, wasn't it? But it's interesting, the interior camera angle for that, because you can actually hear the noise he's making as he's trying to sort of overcorrect it, can't you? And he's like, you don't normally get that. I mean, obviously in Formula One, you just wouldn't hear it, but you can actually hear the noises he's making as he's plummeting towards this concrete wall. It's quite something.
I mean, would that make Formula One more interesting now to have the noises that the drivers sort of involuntarily make as they're driving the car broadcast on the TV rather than Bono, my tyres are going off, that sort of thing?
Yeah.
Would that be better, do you think?
Yeah, I think if it was more honest and you could hear all the swearing at other drivers, I'd be tempted to start watching it again.
Well, John Cleland did it all with gestures, so there you go. There was no need to be mic'd up for that. He made his feelings absolutely clear. One more big crash to talk about. I think it says something that all of the moments that we've picked out on this episode, apart from Matt Neal's privateer win, are all big shunts, big accidents.
Yeah.
And that's something that really was synonymous with BTCC in the 90s. It was a high risk, high entertainment, high octane, high accident level sport.
Yeah, it was famous for being bumper to bumper, wasn't it? That was always how it was described, in comparison to Formula One, which was there was very little contact, if any, because you just can't do it with single seater open wheel racing. Whereas touring cars, you can have a pretty hefty collision and still carry on. Like in the Cleland Soper clip, the back of Soper's car by the end is like caved completely in, and he's still racing. So it was more conducive to that, wasn't it? So
I'm fairly sure in the 1994 season as well, the season review, there's a clip of the front bumper of one car being dragged under the rear bumper of Jan Lammer's Volvo 850 estate as well. It just ran the course for the entire race after an early impact, which is great to see as well. So my final crash that I'd like to talk about, and we're going back to where we began. We're going back to the Alfa Romeos in the 1994 season. And this is Gabriele Tarquini. And this really is probably my favourite clip. It might not be the best known incident that we're going to talk about, but it's probably my favourite clip because it catches the cameraman by surprise. It catches Murray by surprise. It catches the viewer by surprise. There's just a camera angle of the cars coming round a corner. And then all of a sudden, from the right-hand side of the screen, Tarquini's Alfa just comes flipping over throughout the shot and then ends up luckily on its right side, on its wheels, and then Gabriele just gets up and walks out. But it's such a dramatic crash, and Murray really doesn't let down with the commentary. This was where he didn't have something lined up that he could think of to say. It was just a gut reaction, a lot like the Schumacher and Coulthard incident at Spa, which you spoke about before. I think we can put this in the same category as that.
Yeah, absolutely. This is my favourite Murray Walker commentary moment, I think. It's my favourite humorous one anyway. It's not. Some of his more serious ones, I think, maybe were better for different reasons, but this is definitely the funniest.
Peter McIntyre's the right-hander. This is really close. Through the chicane. And off! It's Tarquini. What happened? Gabriele Tarquini in the Alfa Romeo. Thank heavens he's safe, out of the car, rushing to safety. And the crowd have shown their appreciation that he's all right. But it's a very dazed and battered Gabriele leaning against the barrier. No wonder. Breathless. Now here's a replay. Let's see what happened. Into McIntyre's. He's chasing Rydell's Volvo. Harvey's behind him. He's been hit. Roll! Thank heavens for safety belt.
Well, let's round up the discussion then with our thoughts on the tracks, because I think as far as I know, the tracks have always stayed the same in touring cars, haven't they? I guess there's a limited number of tracks in the UK. I know they had Rockingham was added for a bit in the 2000s, but unlike Formula One where they switch it up quite often now, it was just the usual ones, wasn't it, every year. If you could drive around any BTCC track, what would you like to drive around?
Well, I mean, the obvious answer would be Silverstone, because obviously that's also the F1 track, so you'd really get two for the price of one there. But I think the real answer for me has to be our home track of a sort, the closest track to us, which is Thruxton. I've been there a few times to see the touring cars, and in a way, I have actually done this because I visited Thruxton for a weekend. This is probably about 10 years ago now with Legend of the Pod, Big Tim Parker. We camped over, and on the Saturday evening after the qualifying and the support races had all been concluded, they threw the gates open to the course and you were just allowed to walk around the course. It was a lovely summer's evening. We walked a lap of the track, which was about 2.5 miles. We had a sprint race between ourselves up towards the finish line, and it was a great experience. So I have done a lap of Thruxton, but only on foot, not actually in a car. So I would love to do that if I got the chance. What's your answer?
I think it might be on the touring car game. I did always enjoy Knock Hill. It's such a wild place, isn't it? It feels like you're in the middle of nowhere, and it's quite hilly, and it was always raining. And it's also home to Duffer's Dip, one of the toughest corners in UK motorsport. But I think it would probably be, I mean, Brands Hatch. Brands Hatch Indy is so iconic, isn't it? It's like the old Formula One track, and that first corner, Paddock Bend, with the massive sort of runoff area, rumble strip, sort of with the adverts on it, is iconic. So maybe I would say that. I always loved racing around Croft on Toka on the touring car game because it had a bit of everything. But I think, yeah, going around Paddock Bend in my Ford Escort Mark IV would be, which I don't actually own. This is just in my mind, of course. Would be something, I think. So that would be my choice. Up to Druids, and then that's making me want to play the game again.
Can we give a special mention to Snetterton, which from a topographical angle always to me looked like a slice of bread, and also, of course, lest we forget, Hades. I'll tell you what, I'll meet you at Hades, and we'll race the tanks around there. How does that sound?
Oh yeah, yes please.
So that wraps up our discussion about British touring cars in the 90s. There's obviously so much more to cover there. And if anybody has anything that they'd like to bring about maybe a touring car race that they actually went to, or a touring car race that they fondly remember, favourite cars, favourite liveries, favourite tracks, please do get in touch with that. Alex, how do our listeners do that?
They can find all of our links to all of our social media and our email address and everything like that on our link tree, which is linked to below. linktr.ee/allright90s podcast, and it's all on there, so just go on there and send us a message. We'd love to hear from you.
Next time we'll be taking another look at a random UK top 40 from the 90s with our resident pop expert Joe Barter, and it's time to find out which chart we're going to be looking at. So let's refer to our preferred random date generator of choice, random.org. I've input all of the data that we need to make this choice. And here we go. We'll be looking at the chart from the 11th of December, 1991. That's the day after my third birthday. How about that?
It's an early one. I'm hoping everything I do is going to be in that chart. It should be from that year.
It's definitely around that time, isn't it? It's definitely around that
fingers
time.
Crossed. So it's good to go to the beginning of the decade because our last one was late in the decade. So let's have something a bit earlier.
So until we meet again over the airwaves, it's goodbye from me. I'm just off to see if there are any Vauxhall Calibras for sale in the free ads.
And it's goodbye from me. I'm just off to go and drool over that Renault Laguna RT Sports that I found on the internet and will never be able to afford.
Bye for now.
Bye.
Oh, off! It's Tarquini!